ISIS in Afghanistan? And are we at risk? Are we at more risk?
You know, once we're not there, there's always an elevated risk. I mean, I think everybody in the intelligence community and the national security community understands that when you have a large ungoverned space, and, you know, to call the Taliban the government is probably generous. It's a large and contested space. You're going to have the possibility for more threats. But, you know, 20 years of staying there has changed the landscape. And I think the idea that somehow we can simply contain all threats in the world by just being present where they are, you know, we've learned our lesson about that. You just cannot reduce the world to zero risk. So will there be more bad guys? And is it possible that there will be more dangers emanating from this part of the world? Yes, but I think the American people, I hope the American people have decided that they understand that you can't live in a world with zero risk, and that if they'd rather have American forces home, which I think they have said overwhelmingly and clearly to the commander-in-chief, then, you know, that's a risk that the American public is willing to take. I think we're not blind. We're not suddenly, you know, without resources, and we're not helpless in that part of the world. It makes things more difficult, but it doesn't send us all the way back to square one, you know, 21 years ago.
Well, Carol, as one of your colleagues points out, further to that point, is that the forever war isn't over. It's entering a new phase. And of course, President Biden followed a deal that was put in place by his predecessor, someone you covered deeply and knew well, Donald Trump. What was it about that administration and their dealings with the Taliban that has gotten us to this point?
It's such a good question, Chris, because Donald Trump's idea of how this would happen would be like, you know, the snap of a finger. In fact, some of his aides in the final weeks and days of his administration were proposing almost like a victory announcement about how the war had been ended overnight. And that caused incredible consternation in the Pentagon. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, and other members of the Pentagon top brass were on guard for an order to come down from the White House for this sort of overnight departure. They all envisioned sort of those scenes from Saigon or something similar, you know, the last helicopter on the top of a building and people cloying for it. I would also say that, you know, President Biden has made his choice here. He is not tied and bound to something that Donald Trump articulated, the peace agreement with the Taliban. Biden could have chosen what he wanted to do there. But he is in agreement with the American people. Let's leave. And I would remind everybody of something pretty important that the U.S. government said under President Obama and also under President Trump. And that was that this war was failing. It was secretly failing behind the scenes. People in the Pentagon were trying to sort of brush over it, paper over it, make it more attractive. But ultimately, the success at stabilizing this country was only lasting as long as the coalition forces were in each of these communities. The efforts and the programs to root out corruption, to make sure the Taliban wasn't the sort of grievous force that it is, didn't last very long. Our architecture and our scaffolding there just didn't have the kind of penetration, despite 20 years of our presence, that people hoped when Peter Baker and others landed those first days.
We've heard from the president in recent days, most specifically Peter, after the deaths of those 13 Americans. What do you think that we might expect to hear from the president tomorrow? Are you surprised, for example, he put out a statement today and mentioned those 13 service members who were lost at the end of it, but were you surprised he didn't have something to say today?
Well, I mean, it is a little surprising in a way. It's the end of a 20-year war. Usually you hear from a president, but if we hear from him tomorrow, I don't think that matters a great deal in terms of timing. I think what he will probably say is, to defend once again his decision to get out, to make the points that have been made here right now, which is that this is something he promised on the campaign trail. It is something his predecessor promised as well through this deal that he made with the Taliban. It's something that most Americans want. It's the conclusion that a lot of people have come to after 20 years of war, that it was time for us to get out. What I'll be interested to hear him say and address is, what does he say to the Afghans who are left? The Afghans who worked with American forces or with American businesses or American government or NGOs who did not get out. And then, of course, there are thousands left behind who feel that they have a target on them now under the Taliban whip. What does he say to the 38 million Afghans who might not have worked with the Americans but are now going to be living once again under a very, very brutal, totalitarian regime, to the extent, as Tom says, there is a government? Those are important questions as well. But I think that he will portray this as a progress for the American people, that we're pulling away from forever wars, as he calls them, and it was never our idea to remake Afghanistan in our own image, even though that's sort of what we tried and failed to do. And then it's time to move on.
It is true, Tom Nichols, though, that some of the most vocal critics of the president right now, including Democrats, are veterans who are very concerned about the people who were left behind, who were side by side with them and who served them, the Afghans who were interpreters and served in other roles. Here's what we heard from Secretary of State Blinken late today about the Taliban.
While we have expectations of the Taliban, that doesn't mean we will rely on the Taliban. We'll remain vigilant in monitoring threats ourselves, and we'll maintain robust counterterrorism capabilities in the region to neutralize those threats if necessary.
And yet he also said that we are going to have to, Tom, rely on them, and that we do rely on them in terms of helping to, in terms of those assurances that they gave the United States government that they would allow the folks who want to leave to leave. Is that feasible?
No. At some point, it does get the rhetoric about the Taliban, or the statements about the Taliban coming out of the White House, can really make you wince. But on the other hand, they don't have much choice at this point. This is just the situation we're in. This is what surrender and retreat looks like. We're going to have to just accept that this was always the option. We were either going to stay and just create a kind of permanent presence and outposts in Afghanistan, or we were just going to accept that it had to be handed over to the Taliban. And I think there's simply no point in not talking this way. But I think the language about relying on them and, calling on them to be inclusive and other things that have come out of the White House and the State Department aren't helpful. But I think the other problem here is that we need to hear about an articulated policy about Afghanistan. The war is over, but we still have to have a policy in this part of the world. And the Secretary Blinken started to talk about that. We're going to have robust counterterrorism capabilities and so on. But to follow up on Peter's point about tomorrow, I hope the president says, and here's what happens in the coming days. Here's what we're looking at to, because I think a lot of Americans just want to kind of dust their hands off and forget this place that they were never that interested in over the past few years. And, we can't afford to do that. There has to be some kind of policy about Afghanistan, and it's going to have to include how we actually deal with and what we think of the possibilities of dealing with the Taliban are.
And Carol, before we go, I want to ask you about the House committee investigating January 6th. We now know that they have asked 35 telecom and social media companies to retain records involving communications from a group of GOP members of Congress. What does that tell you about where this committee is going, about their approach?
Well, you can look at it in the most basic way, Chris, which is that for any investigation, from a local police department to a federal prosecutor in New York, phone records are a treasure trove of following who was talking to who. You don't always find the content. You can't hear the conversation. This is not the NSA, but amazing things are learned when you discover who was calling who when. And it may prove very important, because while you may not know exactly what, say, a Jim Jordan and a Mark Meadows, White House Chief of Staff, may have said on January 5th, you now know you can ask a particular lawmaker about what he was talking about with the Chief of Staff on January 5th. All of these things end up being really big and potentially powerful clues, not answers, but clues. And it strikes me as well that what it probably indicates is that members of the committee and their investigators, probably more importantly, are hearing sort of sidelong information that points to specific lawmakers, that points to what lawmakers were saying at the time about their conversations, and may have been sharing with their peers, and hence those phone records become much more interesting.
To be continued. Carol Lennig, Peter Baker, Tom Nichols, thanks to all of you tonight. And coming up, former FEMA Administrator Peg Frugate is here on the daunting recovery effort ahead for Louisiana as the city of New Orleans, as you saw, remains in the dark tonight. And later, how some hospitals being pushed to the brink by COVID patients are having trouble taking care of those who don't have the virus. The 11th hour just getting underway.